Hello everybody and welcome to this visual guide of the features Rewritten Ultimate. This video will go over the LPDU strats for Phase 1 Fatebreaker. Before we begin, I must give a disclaimer that these strats were created early on in the patch and better strats may be planned out in the future. I recommend joining the official LPDU Discord server at discord.gg/LPDU to get the most up-to-date strats. That said, let's begin. The fight starts with Cyclonic Break. Fatebreaker will channel either lightning or fire around himself while this cast is charging. Keep the element that he channels in mind as it will be needed later. Once the cast ends, every player will get a Protean baited towards them. There will be a total of 4 Protean casts, alternating back and forth. You can think of it like the transition Proteans in M4S. As the second Protean goes off, the element Fatebreaker was channeling will come into play. If he was channeling lightning, we need to spread, as every player will have a spread AoE targeted on them, and if he was channeling fire, we stack in the middle safe spots, as supports will be targeted for stack markers that need to be soaked by 2 players each. Once all the Proteans go off, the main threat will get a Powder Mark Trail Tank Buster. This Tank Buster will give a 16-second vulnerability debuff to whoever takes it, so swap tanks after it goes off. You can choose to either keep the aggro on the off tank until the next tank buster toward the end of the phase, or swap tanks back once the vulnerability debuff is over. For the sake of simplicity, I will keep the aggro on the off tank until later in this guide. The tank buster, along with the vulnerability debuff, will give the player a Powder Mark debuff. Powder Mark targets the debuff player and another player closest to the Powder Mark with a small AoE. After the tank buster, Fatebreaker will begin casting Utopian Sky, and once again channel either lightning or fire. Keep in mind the element he channels. As Utopian Sky goes off, every player should move behind their markers to resolve the next mechanic, with both tanks 4 ticks closer to each other to resolve Powder Mark at the same time. Utopian Sky will spawn 8 clones, 4 on each cardinal and 4 on each intercardinal. These clones are only visible if you're near them and they telegraph how to resolve the next mechanic. If your clone raises his gunblade into the sky, that means he will cast an across arena cleave. Players whose clones will cleave should move into the middle of the arena to signal this, along with the player directly in front of them. So, if the person in front of you is moving in, you should also move in even if your clone isn't telegraphing a cleave. In the end, there will be 2 players that stay behind. These 2 players are where the safe spots will be. This mechanic is basically strength of the ward from DSR, and we use the same triangle formation at the safe spots to resolve this mechanic. To determine who goes where, Group 1 will always go to the side with red and purple markers, and Group 2 will always go to the side with yellow and blue markers. After Utopian Sky resolves, Fatebreaker will start casting Cyclonic Break and channel either lightning or fire again. Proteans repeat, and Fatebreaker's element will determine whether we spread or stack for them. As Proteans go off, one of Fatebreaker's clones will spawn on top of the A marker and begin channeling another element. The opposite of this element will determine the safe spot for the next mechanic. At this point, you should have 5 Fatebreakers in total in the arena. 1 in the middle, which is the main boss, 1 clone up north channeling fire, 1 clone in either the west or east cardinal channeling lightning, and 2 extra that will tether into players. You can ignore the tethers for now, I will explain how to resolve it later on. First, the clone that spawned on the east or west cardinal will cleave the middle of the arena from east to west, and expand after a slight delay. Move into the north and south edges of the arena to dodge this attack. After Burst Strike Lightning, another clone will cast Burst Strike Fire. This time, the north clone will cleave the middle of the arena from north to east before the knockback goes off. This is where the A clone's element at the second Proteans come into play. The opposite element of the clone is where we need to be knocked back into. Move into the middle of the arena right after the north clone's cleave goes off to time the knockback correctly, and make sure Group 1 is north and Group 2 is south. After we get knocked back, we need to resolve our tethers, which will be given to us during the Burst Strike Fire cast. If each light party has 1 tether, then we don't need to do anything as it's already correct. However, if one of the light parties has 2 tethers, one of the tethers will swap with the opposite party's tank. The swap priority for this is tanks, melees, ranged, and healers. The tethered players will be levitated, and the light parties need to stand below them to soak the stag AoE that goes off with them. After tethers, Fatebreaker will appear in the middle and begin casting Burnished Glory, a raid wight that needs to be mitigated and give each player a bleeding status effect. After the raid wight, Fatebreaker will begin casting Fall of Faith. During this cast, 4 players will be chosen to get tethers with an element. You can determine the element by the color of the tether. To resolve this mechanic, we use a conga line formation, then adjust as tethers get assigned. Tether 1 and 3 will go north, tether 2 and 4 will go south, and the remaining players will follow the tethers they are closest to. A good way to understand this mechanic is by separating the 4 players left behind into 2 even groups. The 2 northmost players will go north, and the 2 southmost players will go south. To bait lightnings, we use a boss relative strat. The northmost player of each group will bait the lightning left, looking at the boss. The southmost player of each group will bait the lightning right, looking at the boss. And the other player will bait it middle, staying behind the current tether. To resolve the fire tethers, everyone will simply stay behind the tether. This can be a bit confusing to understand at first, but doing it a few times should give you a clear image of how to do it. Regardless, tethers will go off in order: tether 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Either bait lightnings or stack behind the tether to soak fire, and you should resolve this mechanic correctly. After Fall of Faith, we get another Burnished Glory raid wight, followed by another tank swap buster. If your off tank kept aggro until this point following the first swap buster, the off tank will take the buster and the main tank will go back to top aggro. If you didn't keep your off tank in aggro, resolve it like normal. This will once again give a 16-second vulnerability debuff and a powder mark. After the swap buster, Fatebreaker will begin casting Burnt Strike and signal a knockback cleave or expanding cleave depending on the element he's channeling. Simultaneously, 3 enumeration towers will spawn on one side of the arena, requiring a total of 6 players to soak them to resolve correctly. As Burnt Strike's cast bar finishes, Fatebreaker will cleave the middle of the arena, followed by the knockback or expanding cleave. Tanks will position themselves across the towers to resolve their powder mark, and the rest of the party needs to position themselves correctly to resolve the towers. In order to make towers easier, we have 3 anchor players who always take their set tower, and 3 adjust players that will adjust based on which tower needs more players. The anchor players are Healer 1 in the north tower, Range 2 in the middle tower, and Healer 2 in the south tower. And the adjust players are Melee 1 north, Ranged 1 middle, and Melee 2 south. To give an example, if all 3 towers require 2 players, every player will go to their respective towers. If, say, the middle tower requires 4 players, all adjusters will stack in the middle tower. If the north or south tower requires more than 2 players, the closest player to the tower will adjust. So if south tower requires 3 players, range 1 will adjust to the south tower as long as the middle tower doesn't also require 2 players. You just need to see which towers need an extra player and which ones don't, then adjust as required. After the towers and powder mark, Fatebreaker will begin casting another Burnished Glory. This time, this is his Enrage. Kill him before the cast goes off or you'll wipe your raid. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in Phase 2.